As you've found, we've got 7 questions that we're wrestling with in terms of this whole project. And even this morning's session, really, we heard some of these questions asked. We think they're challenging, ongoing questions. This is another chance to look at them. The session this morning was all about how can the interaction between PSTs and scientists be productive in a science centre or a museum. What we're going to be looking at this afternoon are examples of interactions between pre-service teachers learning with scientists in settings other than centres. So it's really another insight into the richness of what ReMSTEP's all about. We're not just thinking it's 1 or 2 strategies to address the big question of the day and of the decade and of the century. How really do we make a difference in quality in teaching of science and maths? And to what extent can we energise the preparation of teachers to address part of the challenge? There are the 7 questions. Some of us have been looking at these questions for about 30 years and we still don't agree. So it's an offer or an invitation for you to contribute. We're going to have some presentations that will feed into potential answers for those questions, but we're seeing it as an ongoing issue across all of those points. I'm going to talk very briefly again, and then we've got 6 case studies, examples of interaction between PSTs and scientists in settings other than science centres, to give you the flavour of the range of things going on in ReMSTEP. Then we've got a panel, as we had this morning, to react as however they like or however David guides them, as to what their experiences have suggested as answers to the 7 questions. Then it's over to you. We want your feedback, commentary, anything that occurs to you as a contribution to these matters. What can be learnt or understood or gained by this main assumption of ReMSTEP, that there's something inherently good about having PSTs have direct or mediated contact, interaction, partnerships with practising scientists? In Central Committee, we have lots of discussion about potential answers to this around gains in knowledge, skills, passion, enthusiasm, currency of methods, new curricula. What are the gains for scientists? We heard a bit of that this morning. There's a chance to think further about what can be the gains for scientists and mathematicians in that partnership. And we will be looking at the 6 examples to shed light on that question in terms of precise case studies. Often we've built on partnerships in the past to think about the answer to the second question, about what are the range of choices of possible interactions? Are there things we're missing? How can we optimise the potential for multiple connections? You would have seen this morning, but Russell's diagram is a handy reminder of just the complexity of all of the possible interactions if we think about PSTs and scientists, whether we think about STEM practitioners, as noted there top, or we think about the educators, or we think about resources, products, processes, pre-service teacher input and teacher-ed input. So there's really a huge range of potential ways to have the partnership between the PSTs and the scientists focused, meaningful, sustainable, and informing what they do beyond pre-service preparation. We've already heard some of the answers to this question, but we're interested in having another bite at it this afternoon. The enablers clearly are prior institutional arrangements in our 4 universities. We're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of things going along parallel to ReMSTEP that complement what we're trying to do. Past partnerships, there's incredible goodwill as we've heard this morning, when people have the opportunity to participate. And again we hear about the passion of scientists and the pleasure in being able to work with PSTs and communicate. The constraints, and we haven't heard too much about that, but it is a big challenge to negotiate different worlds, to turn science research, practice and methods into workable curriculum. It's so easy just to say, but it really does involve a lot of complementary understanding and goodwill. And then there's the question of fit for need, the work of the scientists, how can that feed into curriculum? Workloads, we've heard other sorts of suggestions about the constraints. The other thing that emerges from ReMSTEP is just the reminder of the incredible diversity of changing multidisciplinary nature of science, scientific practices. And it's quite a challenge thinking about how we can capture that or think about what expertise or what understanding should PSTs have as they enter the profession against the incredible range of changing multidisciplinary practices in the field. It looks as though there's an assumption too that PSTs don't know anything about contemporary practice, and as we've heard, that's not the case, but there's still a complicated story there. I'm going to bundle the last three questions. We've heard them already. I guess I'm interested in your reactions after you hear of our 6 examples, the panel, and we start thinking about, well, how can these interactions alter the science curriculum? Yes, they can. We were hearing an example this morning about how the work can then feed into Victorian state curriculum around subjects as it's informed by current practice. We're very interested in what you perceive as future directions. We've had suggestions already, but there's more. We're interested in canvassing all the possibilities. And the big question, we still seem, over 100 years later, like a bunch of colonies, all doing separate things, suspicious of feds, suspicious of other states. And really, we've got to think much more tactically about the big picture. And I think that's part of making upscaling possible. They're the 7 questions. So that you've got a prompt to thought, we've got a handout rather than showing them as we go. And the presenters, I'll hand over to David, who will explain the 6 case studies that we are going to offer to the conversation about what the answers are to these 7 questions. David.
So changing hats slightly from MC to explaining part of what I've been doing for ReMSTEP. I'm not Jana Mollison, not even close. She's over there. And I just want to play you a short movie where Jana's voice speaks quite prominently and quite impressively, as we heard in the previous session, about what she got out of working with a scientist. In this case, it was me. Now, if Bill Gates is kind to us, can we have the audio up, please, guys?
In La Trobe University.
I'm just going to stop that and start it from the start.
There are a lot of interesting things happening in primary education and teacher training already in La Trobe University, in particular in the regions where La Trobe University has a campus in Bendigo. And there's one in particular which is called MISTI, which is Multidisciplinary Science Teacher Integration Education. And it forms part of the teacher training for primary teachers. One of their assessments is to design a week of activities for a particular class level with a strong science theme. They submit it to the school for approval, and if the school likes what they see, they get the pre-service teachers to run it. Now, we saw an opportunity here for engaging the pre-service teachers with practicing research scientists. That's one of the core innovations of the ReMSTEP platform.
Olivia and myself have been working with Year 1 students at Girton Grammar, and we have been focusing on physical and chemical change. We asked David to come to Bendigo to help us with the liquid nitrogen. So we explained to the students that we would be getting a visiting scientist or a visiting expert. Because we were so involved with making crystals, we also told them that that was his specialty and that's what he knew lots and lots about. So that really guided some of our questions. We just loved watching our crystals grow, but Ben, what were we wondering?
How did the crystals form?
So how did the crystals form? That's the question. In a liquid, the atoms are kind of going like this. They're moving around and they're bouncing across each other. And when you cool them down, they go slower and slower until eventually they all just sort of clump together. It seems to be commonly agreed that something magic happens when a scientist is put in touch with pre-service teachers and students. We're trying to articulate exactly what it is. And one of the first things we realised was that the ReMSTEP program gave us an opportunity to think with our hands, if you like.
When David put the flour in the liquid nitrogen, the leaves got all curly because it was really cold, but when I stepped on it, it was really hot.
I put the pre-service teachers in touch with technicians and late-stage postgraduate students to try and brainstorm ideas of activities they could do in the schools that are hands-on. We totally committed to a hands-on learning by doing experience, and we found very quickly that we could help enormously with very simple technical support. If I get the liquid nitrogen and I put it on the balloon, what do you think is going to happen? You think it's going to pop? You think it might get smaller? Why do you think it might get smaller? Is it just a guess? Because it's a very good guess. I think it's going to get smaller. You know why? Because the air inside the balloon, when it gets colder, sort of shrinks down a bit. And when it gets hot, it expands. There we go.
There it goes. Whoa!
He put it on the ground, then it expanded, then he put it in liquid nitrogen, then it shrunk.
We haven't just used the Discovery Centre in isolation. So we started at school with the engage and explore phases. What the Discovery Centre was great for, and particularly David, was to start to get into the explain phase. So now that when we go back to school, we'll be able to elaborate on that more, and maybe the students might start to come up with some of their own experiments, and then we'll be able to evaluate the work. A really important part of coming to the Discovery Centre is moving through the centre with your students and talking to them. The conversations that come out of the experiments and activities are really important. What do you think is going to happen when we move this across the board? What do you predict will happen?
When it's this side, it will move away, and when it's this side,
It'll come together. Wow. So did you want to move this across the board and we'll see what happens? We've talked lots about predicting, and they have lots of great describing words and thoughts about what might happen. They're great at observing things. We've observed spaghetti change, we've observed popcorn changing, and they can come up with some great words to describe what they're seeing. And we're getting to the explain part now. You find out your practicum placement a full term before you go out and teach the unit of work. So we visited Girton every week last term, which was fantastic. We got to know the students really well. Also having a full term to prepare the unit of work, because it's 15 lessons. So it was great to have that preparation time and the preparation time with the students and getting to know them.
At present we have 3 groups of year ones, and so the student teachers have taught the same lesson 3 times, and in that's been a wonderful experience for them, because during that lesson, each lesson, they could modify each of the lessons just to fit with the children. We love the idea of having the ReMSTEP experience in 4th term, because at this stage of the year ones have grown in confidence, and science is their absolute love.
It's really good to have a scientist to see, because I've never seen a real scientist before.
For children to see a real live scientist in operation has been a wonderful experience for them, and it has further expanded and consolidated their understanding of the topic that we're studying.
Organising an excursion was a real challenge. It's something Olivia and I hadn't done before, but we were really grateful to have that experience. And we were actually a little bit nervous about today and how it would go and what would happen, but we were really pleased that the kids were engaged and had lots of great questions and were really interested in what we were doing.
I have had 7 groups of Misty students whilst I have been at Girton. Whenever the opportunity arises to have a Misty student, I would have to say I'd be the first person to volunteer, because I know of the quality teaching the students present to my children, filled with rich experiences.
Now, the purpose of these movies that I'm showing is really to introduce you to the stars of it, which in this case is Jana, and to prompt the discussion for the panel. I will make a couple of comments. This is not meant to be a dictation of this is how you do it. This is what almost a naive bolt-on was. And what we bolt on was to a program that existed called Misty, which was run out of Bendigo for pre-service teachers by Peter Cox. Peter, are you in the house? Yep. He's a genius. It's won awards. This isn't... So we bolted... What ReMSTEP has done is try to bring the scientists and the equipment into it. Also, just a quick note that the movies are made by a guy called Glenn Dixon, who's over there. Hands up, Glenn. Yeah, he is awesome. He's a really, really nice, talented young man. And Louise Bow from All School Partners was actually introduced us and has helped work with us. So there's a lot of people doing these things behind the scenes. Jana is looking for a job at the moment. In a year. So you know where to find her. Moving on to the next one. I am also not Jennifer Ling. Jennifer Ling is over there. You can't see her because she's in silhouette, but you'll see her in a moment. I'm going to play another movie and then invite Jen up very briefly to introduce herself and talk about what happens. This was another ReMSTEP sort of innovation. I call it thinking with our hands in the Silicon Valley sense. And I will just click that.
Of implementing inquiry science in different science class situations. This episode looks at a science activity in a Year 5 class. The aim of using an inquiry science approach in this instance is to develop science inquiry skills in the students through acting as scientists conducting an authentic investigation. In this lesson, the students become grime detectives in an activity derived from the TV series Mythbusters. We are going to use the inquiry-based teaching strategy described in the Science by Doing professional learning module on inquiry-based teaching, Predict, Observe, Explain, to promote inquiry learning for the students.
You guys are going to get to choose 2 places in the school you think are going to be the most grimy, and then you're going to test to figure out which one is grimier. So what do you think the word grimy means? Gross? Bacteria? I like that. Before we could make a prediction, we needed to decide what grimy actually meant. So was it dirty? Was it bacteria covered? Was it fungi covered? What does predict mean?
Hypothesize or guess what's going to happen.
Hypothesize, exactly. Guess what's going to happen? I've got predict as we're going to use what we know to make a guess. So now we know what we have decided grimy means. And grimy means it's got bacteria and it's got fungi on it. I want you to turn to the person next to you. You're going to pair and share, and you're going to think of 2 places in the school you think are absolutely disgustingly grimy. Handrail, beautiful. What else? You touch the door handles. Door handles are great. So you just need to be really specific when you're making your prediction. By using the predict, observe and explain method, I gave them space to think and decide for themselves what would be exciting to test.
I think the bottom edge of the toilet is more grimier than my rubber because no one cleaned it and even touched it.
I like that. So what we've done is we've made a prediction. But what do we have to do now?
Now we have to test.
Yes, test. We're going to perform an experiment. we're performing a test to check our prediction. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? We are going to use something that helps to grow some bacteria. This is called an agar plate. So it's agar inside a petri dish. Around the agar plate, it's got something called parafilm. And that seals the agar plate to make sure we don't get any other bacteria growing in it that we didn't want there. We're performing an experiment. We need to do something called a fair test. Have you heard of that term before?
No.
What's a fair test, do you think? Yes?
So when you test things, you don't put way more.
Yeah, so you make sure you're testing the same amount of something. So we're making sure that we're testing only one thing at a time.
I predict that a piece of apple from the compost bin will be mouldier and more bacterial than a sample from the screen of my iPhone.
I predict that Kim's whiteboard is grimier than Paul's keyboard.
We moved on from having our prediction and went to actually testing, got the kids out of their chairs, they put on their lab coats, they went around with all their agar plates and tested all the different places that they thought would be the grimiest in the school. For me, again, one of the most important things was that time at the end, getting them to reflect on it. What was the most exciting thing about the activity? What would they do differently? What did they find out that they didn't realise before?
The most interesting thing I did today was sticking the parafilm on the agar dish.
The most interesting thing today was working together.
Once it's been left for 4 days, we come back again, we bring out all of our plates and see what grew. Our first job is to observe our results. We are going to take our plates and we're going to just go and sit down and have a look at them. We want to have a look and figure out what's happened.
Toilet urinal.
I chose this activity because it's grimy. Kids like it. It's exciting and it's an investigation. They were being scientists for the day, or in our case a couple of days, and realising that science happens everywhere and it happens all the time. Okay, so right now we're observing and we're going to move into explaining our results. We're going to use what we know and our observations to figure out why it happened.
I was actually surprised that syringe rubber was more grimier than my nose.
What explanation could you have for that?
Because more people touch the rubber than
Don't putting their fingers up their nose. I particularly liked one boy's idea that he would test up his nose, because that does grow some interesting things. I thought that was, you know, he was really getting into it. He was getting into the idea of it being disgusting and grimy, and I play on that. We've looked at our observations and we've brought them back to our prediction, and then we've explained anything that we sort of was a bit strange, or even why we were right. We might have thought that the toilet seat was dirtier than our hand, and it was. So we're going to explain why that happened. So explanation is bringing our observation back to our prediction and giving it a reason. And that's what we need to see, probably, all these steps.
I really like what you've done here, where you've gone around the edges of all of these little colonies, we call them. That's nice observation. And yours is under the toilet seat. This is great, because it's clean, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and actually, this has been found when they do these tests, that underneath the toilet seat is one of the cleanest places in the house, because everybody cleans it all the time. Yeah, and I think I can see lots of fungus spores here. Fungus, that sort of furry stuff around the edge. We'll look at one of these under the microscope in a minute and try and see if we can see the individual spores.
Having a guest scientist is fantastic, and I think it's good to have them there, maybe out of their comfort zone, partly because when you have a scientist in their comfort zone, their knowledge base is so much higher than the students, and it can be really, really hard for them to pull that right back down again and come at it from the kids' point of view. But the scientific process is essentially the same, and they can be as interested and excited as the students because it's new to them as well.
First, I predicted the bottom edge of the toilet is more grimier than my rubber, and then I tested with a cotton thing, and then we put it on the agar plate to make the bacteria grow. My prediction was right. The bottom edge of the toilet is more grimier than my rubber.
I predicted that the compost bin would be grimier than the heater because there was food scraps and that would grow mold. I observed that
there was multicolored bacteria and different kind of mold, and it was really disgusting.
I think it actually worked really well, coming out really fresh and new and exciting and interesting and moving, and it was quite fluid, it worked well. I would, however, change the way the presentations worked. If possible, I would have them using posters, it's great, but I would have them posted up around the room, and if we were going to do a big unit of work on this sort of thing, I would actually I'd get them to do nice big posters, and I'd probably even get a science night where parents could come in and the kids could explain it to their parents and their families and get that chance to be excited about it with other people, because I think that just builds it even more.
So thanks. While Jen's making her way up, I'm just going to make two very super quick observations. Now, I'm a scientist, I'm not an educator, not certainly of primary school kids. And we just went ahead and did this stuff, and then we showed the movies to the experts later. So showing these movies to Peter and Russell and Vaughan was revelatory, because they were very polite, but skeptical. And one of the best conversations I've had with these guys was when we sat down and picked apart what was really happening here, where the learning really was, what the role of the scientist really was and really should have been. And I learnt more in that one 10-minute slot in your office than I think I had in the previous 5 years about what a scientist could really do. And that conversation, I think, is one of the most important byproducts of the ReMSTEP project, which is to get us talking, to get the dialogue between the tertiary educators, the lecturers, and the practicing scientists, and then the scholars of teaching and learning who are training pre-service teachers. And we found that having these movies has just managed to focus the discussion and give us a common visual language. So that's been very interesting. The other quick comment is that when I showed that to Dorothy Smith, who's another academic in the education department at La Trobe, she nearly died. She said, "You gave them agar plates? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" I said, "Well, we did a risk assessment, we put parafilm around them." And she said, "Still, are you seriously getting them to cultivate rhinoviruses in a primary school?" And I hadn't really thought about it, because I'm used to the padded cell of the university. So, yeah, do your risk assessments, folks. Anyway, this is Jen Ling. Make her welcome.
Okay, so yes, that was one of my first concerns too, and I was very surprised that I was allowed to go ahead and actually perform this experiment when I was a pre-service teacher in a primary school setting, because it's really unusual. I first became involved with ReMSTEP at the start of 2014 when it was presented to our cohort at the start of the year, and I thought it was an exciting program to get into nice and early, so I jumped ahead and joined in. The first idea was actually for me to go ahead and meet with a scientist and teach an aspect of that scientist's research. My scientist was Dr. Christine Hawkins, to my students. I think that was probably aimed more towards secondary students, because I straight off realised that in a primary setting that just was not going to work. So I started thinking about what I really wanted to get out of the ReMSTEP relationship, and for me that was just an exciting engagement with students. So I decided that being my main goal was to engage and excite students in the primary setting in science. So I designed that particular experiment to be performed in a rural school, which was Broadford Primary School, with a bunch of students who would never in a million years get a chance to do this sort of thing. And that was really, really exciting for me, because to take something that I hadn't started doing until university, and that was apparently quite dangerous, to these young students, it livened everything up. It was fantastic. So obviously, as I said in there, I was really appealing to their love of grime and disgust and grossness. And growing bacteria is a bit like a magic trick. You swab something and put it on an agar plate, and it's like magic. Something grows that wasn't there before. But in my particular setting, I was able to give them a great grounding, and they can see through that magic to the science, and that was the exciting part for me. I think it's really important in this sort of the ReMSTEP program to be really, really clear with mentor teachers and schools about what they're going to get out of the pre-service teacher-scientist interrelationship, the interaction, and to support those pre-service teachers really well, because that was really important for me as a pre-service teacher. My mentor was fantastic, and I brought that particular unit in my 5 weeks, went through literacy and maths and social skills along with the science. So that was a fantastic just bonding of all of those areas of the curriculum. And I think in a lot of cases, pre-service teachers are told you teach this and you teach it now, and this is how you're going to teach it and this is why you're going to teach it. So to have that autonomy was fantastic. ReMSTEP helped me with all my challenges. For instance, to even start this idea, I had about 60 ideas that I could do, and they helped me narrow it down to this one, which was, like I said, sort of based on what I'd spoken to Christine about. And they helped me source all the equipment, which I could never have done in a million years, pay for it, which I could never have done in a million years, transport it to the school for me, and then also dispose of it, because that was a big concern given that we were growing agar plates. In a perfect world, I know that in that particular film, that was filmed this year, and we had David come along and be our guest scientist. And when I did this with the students at Broadford, we had a PhD student, I think it was, come in and be the guest scientist that the students presented to. And I felt sorry for her. We had 50 students that we taught this to, and so we had about 25 presentations to go through. And this was her bread and butter. It was boring as all get up for the poor girl. So I would actually not invite a scientist, and if I did, I would invite someone like David, who was out of their comfort zone. And that's what I was talking about on that film, that it wasn't about having any scientists there. That particular mention was about having a scientist not from that area that you're teaching, so that it's new and slightly engaging for them as well. So they're learning something along with the students being able to explain something. And that's why I'd have a parent night, science night, instead of presenting it like that, so that the kids could feel autonomous and present that information and be scientists, teach their parents and their significant adults something new, and that makes them feel very important. Finally, I would say that I think this was a really successful program. Every time I went into my school after that day, about 80% of the students would be saying, "Are you here to teach science again? When are you coming back to teach science?" And given that my goal was not to try and make kids want to be scientists, it was to engage them in science and make science exciting, I think that was a fantastic program, and I had significant success with it. So thank you very much.
So moving it along a little bit, I've got a secret time-saving weapon up my sleeve. A little bit of a shout out to Graham Oliver, who was the person who hasn't appeared on any of these slides, hasn't been mentioned yet. Graham's sitting over there. He was the guy who actually worked with Jen to make sure that she got all the equipment and designed the thing, and he was the guy who stood up. This is before I joined the project. I'm not only Maxine McHugh, I'm also Liz Johnson. And actually shepherded the project through a very difficult transition. So there's a lot of Graham in all of this. I'm going to talk about 2 projects that I'm intimately involved in very, very briefly, uncharacteristically briefly. The Growing Tall Poppies program is to try and address that issue that was brought up in the keynote addresses. Such a small percentage of women are doing advanced maths and physics. It's really quite staggering, and it's getting more extreme. People are disenfranchising themselves. They're hopping off the maths and physics train. So Arroya Barona-Nugent, who happens to be married to one of Australia's most senior physicists, decided to do something about it. And so she created the Growing Tall Poppies program and embedded it in the Centre for Coherent X-ray Science run by Keith. Arroya and I are now trying to scale this up and roll it out. And the particular thing that we're trying to do is involve pre-service teachers with small groups of, say, 15 to 20 students who are coming from a variety of schools under a work experience framework to spend a 3-day intensive at the university embedded in the research groups. The trick is to make sure we don't bring a research group to its knees for a week. And so we're using late-stage PhD students as the scientists. There are many different sorts of scientists. There is a hierarchy of science, I believe. We call postgraduate students, but they're actually practicing scientists, especially towards the end. And then you have the lab heads and the vice-chancellors or whatever, who in many ways are not coal-face scientists, but they certainly have a very good idea of the context. So the Growing Tall Poppies program is trying to mix things together in a way that gets you all of the good juice, but in a sustainable way. I invite you to visit the Growing Tall Poppies website. It's a very good website. It has lots and lots of very nice things in it. and it'll explain a little bit about how it dovetails into ReMSTEP. Let's save 5 minutes. We have two of the pre-service teachers who've been involved in Growing Tall Poppies programs here. Rachel Begley, who's standing over there, who's particularly interested in gender, and we'll maybe talk about that, she's on the panel. And Mun Singh, who is actually worked in Lego shops in Malaysia before she became a PST, teaching people how to use Lego Mindstorms. And she helped us build our Lego Mindstorm activity. She's a very interesting person. Sula, if you're hiring. So the other thing that I'd like to describe that I've been involved in, that I led this project actually, is called FAR Labs, the Freely Accessible Remote Laboratories. We were very, very grateful to receive $640,000 from the federal government, via Ian Chubb, in order to build a remote access laboratory in 3 months without spending any money on equipment. We managed it and we did really well, and we've built on it. So FAR Labs involves students running experiments from a web browser in their classroom, from their phones, from the laptops, and doing radioactivity experiments that you couldn't do in schools without a lot of hassle. A lot of schools threw out their radioactivity sources in the 80s and 90s, too hard. And so now, until recently, it was a core part, it was year 11, unit 1. And how do you do radioactivity? How do you do alpha, beta, gamma? How do you do absorption? How do you do half-life if you've got no prac to go with it? It's a challenge. So we decided we'd make a remote access lab, and we went through the 5Es model and tried to build an entire resource for the teachers. It's free. It will always be free. I am a bit of a hippie. I believe that information wants to be free, and the taxpayer has already paid for this. So that's something that people don't often believe. We've just recently almost got it to the point where it's whitelisted so that schools have to give access to it, interestingly. Schools are very protective about what sort of video streams their kids can download, which when you think about it for a second kind of makes sense. And this has been very successful. It's been used by over 300 schools, and it's growing. There's a bunch of them up in the Cane Belt and the Burdekin in Queensland. We had partners at James Cook University, Curtin University, and you can see the logos down the bottom. Quantum helped us with the pedagogy. Australian Synchrotron provided some experimental stuff. You can log on to an experimental beamline at the Synchrotron. It's an optics beamline, but it's there. And I invite you to get on there and have a look. Get yourself registered, and you can see all the teacher resources. It's a lot of fun. My dream with this was for teachers, to set the labs as homework. To flip the classroom and flip the labs. One direction that's being taken at the moment, which I hadn't anticipated, is that there's a lot of interest from the homeschooling community. Because you can imagine, if you've got a kid with Asperger's you decided to homeschool, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? And I'd like to end my bit with that and invite Stuart Palmer to come up and give his talk. Stuart, make him welcome.
Thanks, David. So, as David said, my name's Stuart Palmer. I'm from the Faculty of Science, Engineering and Built Environment at Deakin, and perhaps a little bit different to many of the other people on the project on the science side, in fact, that I'm actually an engineer by first degree and a whole other life pre-academia, that's back when I had a real job, as I sometimes say. One of the goals of ReMSTEP, and certainly at Deakin, was to find ways to engage pre-service teachers with authentic aspects of contemporary research and development practice. And I put the D in there again as the engineer. So I like to think of it as science and technology. There's an E in the STEM. I'm happy for it to be called technology, that's fine. But very much conceiving modern research practices, research and development. So yes, there's science, but there's also engineering as well. I'll say R&D a lot as opposed to just R. At Deakin, we've got some, world-leading research facilities where there's many tens, in fact hundreds of scientists and engineers engaged in materials research, the Institute for Frontier and Materials. So we looked for ways to engage that fabulous resource. there's a number of things going on, but one of the things we did was to so there's a number of live activities going on where there are postdocs and PhD students and researchers and scientists working with pre-service teachers. But apart from that kind of live experience, we're hoping to get some archival material, if you like, some resources that could be used in other contexts as opposed to face-to-face. So one of the things we thought we'd do is interview some real live scientists and engineers in the wild. So we asked them a series of stimulus questions. And yes, we asked them about their research, but it would take the whole day to show you those recordings. We had trouble stopping them, so I'll pick some of the other questions, which were really about, I guess, the science as a human endeavour aspect. So asking them to place their work in a broader societal context, and maybe a resource that could be used to tackle that tricky area of the curriculum, the science as the human endeavour. Mandy here is one of my undergraduate students from many years ago. She's a research fellow at Carbon Nexus, which is one of the areas inside the Institute for Frontier Materials, working particularly with carbon fibre composite materials. She normally works across a range of commercial research work, so this is work that industry have paid for. And asked her about the question behind one of the research projects she was doing working on, which was a proof of concept commissioned work looking at the use of carbon fibre as an automotive component. And we'll see if we can hear what Mandy's
The reason why we're doing this work is carbon fibre composites offer a lot of advantages over traditional metallic materials. They're lightweight, they're very high strength, and that is perfect for automotive applications. They're trying to reduce the mass of the vehicles to meet the current emission standards and targets. By reducing the weight, we're able to have better performance, and also you use less fuel in your vehicles. So that's one aspect. And so that if those materials are going to be used in the automotive industry, we then need to reach those rapid curing techniques and times. So that's how the research has come about.
So Mandy was particularly alluding to the fact there that traditionally carbon fibre objects take a long time to cure, and if you're going to get it into production automotive, you've got to reach that, one car drops off the assembly line in America every 36 seconds. So a big carbon fibre piece might take 36 hours traditionally. So that's one of the key things. If you can make it in 36 seconds, you can put it in a car, a production car. We were hoping to represent all sorts of aspects of authentic practice. One of them was, kind of to represent the full diversity of people undertaking research and development as a career. But also particularly their kind of, their ordinariness. They're just people, regular people. It could be you. So Matt here is just completing his PhD work at Carbon Nexus. He's writing up. His specific topic is about the bonding between surfaces, carbon fibre surfaces and filler materials in composite sandwich structures. Highly technical work. In fact, we did get him to talk at much greater length about the technical issues with his work. But without any disrespect to Matt, I think he's the excellent embodiment of, the every person researcher. One of the features of modern research work, of course, is it's all team-based, and sometimes these teams are in one location, sometimes they're distributed. So we asked Matt, oops, gotta press the play button, about the importance of teams.
In this sort of research, typically it's a big project, so we do get lots of contributions from a big team. We had a team of 6 or 7 working on this, as well as lots of maybe 5 or 6 other people that weren't doing all the work, but they were there as a reference for questions and things like that, because you can't know everything. So you have a team that can fill most of the gaps of knowledge required for that project, but you always need someone else to help a little bit. But yeah, it's a great team environment. Everyone, especially when you're successful, which isn't always the case, but it was in this project, we were always learning, and everyone, throwing up ideas. Some some a little bit crazy, but sometimes crazy ideas can lead to very good innovation. So, and that's how we were able to really make a successful project by no one getting shut down with a crazy idea, but we always, meet up every week and things like that, and then do a lot of the testing and manufacturing together as well.
So Matt was talking about his contribution also to that carbon fibre automotive component. Moving on, it's a fact of life that contemporary research and development is very much a commercial enterprise. So the Institute for Frontier Materials has about 300 employees. It's very big, and about half its funding comes from commercial work. So half from grant income, the other half from industrial work, commissioned work. And we also did some interviews, including with the director of the IFM, to again get a sense of that kind of broader societal context of modern research and development. In fact, it's a large industrial enterprise and has to be funded. Miriam's research fellow at IFM and is currently working on a industry research organisation funded project to develop the technologies to allow Australian cotton to be used in sportswear. So typically these days it's made out of a polymer, lycra or similar, and that's because it has good elastic properties. Typically cotton's not used, but in terms of sports applications, cotton has a lot of desirable properties, so it's breathable, much better than lycra. So this research project that she's working on is about utilising Australian cotton in sports textiles. So we asked her about where the money comes from.
Working in this research area is very challenging. Getting the funding from the funding body is not that much easy. We were very fortunate when this research question came in, and we put a proposal. So we found a Cotton Research and Development Corporation very much interested in the area as well. You know that cotton, we are not the big producer of the cotton, that in Australia, but we are the fourth exporter of the cotton in the world. So it is very much important for CRDC as well to enhance the production of the cotton and provide the better investment in that sort of in that sort of market as well.
So the CRDC that Miriam referred to is the Cotton Research and Development Corporation. So it's a industry-funded industry research body. So a levy is taken from the cotton producers, money's pooled, and then the CRDC board strategically funds research projects. So it's a good illustration of the complexity of how you get the dollars into this modern R&D research machine. In the interest of time, I won't play Ben's full video, but we got him to asked him about how did he get to be a researcher at Deakin University, and of course we asked all the people that question, and there are many and varied stories, and that's what we wanted to draw out. In fact, that there's a whole range of ways that you might end up as a researcher in a place like the IFM. Ben's project is really interesting. He's working on using silk as a material to develop a material for eardrum repair. So it's really, really interesting work. In fact, if you saw maybe 3 or 4 weekends ago in the Sunday Age, there was a big feature on Ben's work. So this is the videos, if you like, and it's still very much a work in progress. But we're aiming that these will be supported, be a resource that could be used either together or individually, or you could look at one person, you could look at just the different responses to one question, but coming with some supporting materials that provide kind of background and explanation of the science and other and engineering, other ideas behind it, links to the curriculum areas, and activities and experiments that students and teachers could do in the classroom. Here's some photos from me in my library trying to reproduce Matt's carbon fibre sandwich composite beams. And so using some materials found around the house, just a sheet of foam, and some duct tape. So if you make it into a sandwich, which just means wrapping the duct tape around really tightly around the foam, you can see it holds a much higher load. And that's exactly the principles that Matt's working with. And so in a qualitative way, you can get a sense of the research work or the knowledge behind that type of experiment. As I said, it's very much a work in progress, but this was an opportunity to show some of the things we've done so far. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. And Peter, I'll let you introduce yourself, and you are our last speaker for our panel, so
get on with it.
Wake up.
All right, thanks very much. My name's Peter White. I work at Deakin University as a science educator. I'm talking today about some work that I'm doing with pre-service teachers and scientists. If we can just put the movie up, that would be great. That's not me. Help. Okay, today we're going to talk about some multimedia resources with scientists in biology and environmental education. Once we get our movie. We're going to have to go through all the slides again. I will just keep going. Here we go. Excellent. All right, multimedia resources with scientists. Oh, okay. We used these resources to think about, I should be able to pause that. Like, how come I can't? Right. Okay, here we go again. We're thinking about resource development. We want to get our students to empower them to create their own resources, but we use the strategy of digi-explanations, which is taking multimedia resources, and we complexified the issue by asking them to interview a scientist. So that certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit, and this is not working for me. We need to press play. Thanks. So digi-explanations are it's a tool that came out of an OLT. It's looking at engaging students in learning, explaining communications with scientists. So here's an interview with Gary Hoban, who is one of the...
Wollongong University. Gary is the guy who created this idea of digi-explanations. So to model a Skype interview and to also go to the source, I thought that we would ask Gary some questions about digi-explanations.
Essentially, I want students to engage with content. Right? I want them to do something different and think about it in different ways. So it's all about decision making and engagement.
So as I said, we complexified the issue. It wasn't just about crafting a digi-explanation. It was about using these 6 steps to think about a biology concept they wanted to draw out of the VCE curriculum, find a scientist, and put together a learning sequence through this digi-explanation.
I think for me, a digi-explanation was sort of, I broke it down into just the 2 words, so the digital aspect, so that idea of using technology, so computers, all their softwares, applications, and then using that as an explanation for students. So specific point that we pulled out from the curriculum, and then explaining that through technology.
Yeah, and furthermore, investigating current science within that. So using the digi-explanation to explain current science.
So to find out what PCR was and how it was being used in contemporary science, I decided to catch up with my scientific friend, Emily. So, Emily, could you please tell me a little bit about the project you're currently working on?
So my project, I'm working on Pasteurella multisida, which is a gram-negative bacterium that causes fowl cholera in chickens. And so we are...
But it wasn't just the video editing, it was the planning, the learning, the biology again.
Yeah.
Rereading that, getting your interview, organised, organising a day and getting the equipment. So I borrowed from the library.
Yep.
I also borrowed from Peter Huber.
Yeah.
So I got a few things just in case. And then doing the interview. So I had to email questions to the various scientists. So I had to think of those. And sort of storyboarding as well, how I want this to look and sound, make sure I get everything in the one interview because I don't want to have to waste his time again. And then once you got all this video, I had 20 minutes, 25 minutes of video. I had to down to 3 to 5.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus put in stuff around that.
I played around with so many ideas in my head of like what I wanted it to look like and how I wanted the technology to come out. But when it came down to it, me sitting down with my concept and then getting my scientists, then what actually came out at the end was a lot different to what I'd anticipated, just because as you went along that you realised there were certain things that were going to suit and there were certain things that weren't. So I hadn't previously planned on having just a PowerPoint explanation in mind, but I realised that I needed to step out those points of what was going on and make it really clear and visually clear. So I think, it all came back to what concept you started with, then finding a scientist to make that work, and then finally introducing the technology and actually explaining that as a whole. So.
And he'd noticed as he was handling the birds, their beaks felt really hot, something much hotter than the rest of the bird. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. There's heat coming out of them. Are they actually using their beak as some kind of heat radiating device? And so he set up his thermal imaging camera with some captive toucans at a zoo, and found that the beaks glow when they're under the thermal imaging camera.
Is this a learning strategy that you would use with your school students?
Definitely. Yeah. I've already included it in my faux class lessons that I've made since then for other assignments. There's digi explanations and and even smaller things like making your even just in-class presentations more exciting or challenging students to use it, because that's the thing I don't think I would ever think to get students to use it without having that understanding myself.
So this was a strategy used as an assessment tool in a couple of my units. The students were asked to create a digi explanation, but also to complexify the matter by interviewing a scientist and to link the example the scientist could provide to the curriculum. We're interested really in that link of how can we find contemporary science and still see it be real in our curriculum. And so from here we'd like to think about developing more video footage to be used directly in schools with those clear links to the curriculum made quite explicit. This means, of course, we need to find pre-service teachers interested in this kind of work. We need to find scientists interested in having these conversations, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. And then to have that conversation around how to find the links, and then to get the multimedia action working for us. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now, could I invite our panel up to the panel row, and could I ask the lovely lighting folk to bring up the house lights at the front and bring down the stage spots a little bit? It's beautiful, especially these guys here are pretty strong. Is there anybody out there? Can you hear me? Could you hand up the back if you can hear me? Okay, so it's coming through. Beautiful. I can hear that. Thanks. All right. I need a piece of blue paper. Can I please have yours? Thank you. A bit cheeky. So what I'd like you guys to do is, we know who some of you are already because you've spoken, but for those of you who are new to us, could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us where you fit into the taxonomy of ReMSTEP? Because there are so many different sorts of roles that people have. And maybe start with Jen.
So obviously I was a pre-service teacher last year. This year I'm a practicing teacher. I got involved with ReMSTEP through my pre-service teacher training, and I have a history in applied biology and biotechnology.
Thank you.
And I'm Gail Chittleburrow, and I work at Deakin as a science educator. And I've been involved with the IFM project, Institute of Frontier Materials, taking my chemistry pre-service teachers into the IFM. They met with chemists there, working chemists, and they listened to their presentations. Then they had to go back and re-represent their ideas, and then also prepare a teaching resource, very similar to what other projects have done, that could maybe we'll build on those later in the future. So that's how I've been working.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Beagley. I'm in the final weeks of a double degree in teaching and science at La Trobe. I became involved in ReMSTEP a couple of months ago through the Growing Tall Poppies program. I was able to go along, I was able to see students engage with scientists, I was able to engage myself with scientists, thankfully she's here, and I am very keen in looking at gender issues in science. That's a passion of mine that I brought into the degree and was able to engage in that in early years. I did some gender studies subjects, and I was able to think about what kids are bringing into a classroom, irrelevant of how good they are at maths and science, irrelevant of who they are, they're bringing in issues to the classroom and how to, and I'm interested in finding ways to acknowledge those and to move forward with science studies.
Actually, just to shout out to Milicia Milipeta here, who's the scientist that Rachel was referring to. Stand up, Milicia. Milicia is from Lesotho. She was actually come over to do a master's, and she was my research student, and a very good one. And so we're very glad to have her at the conference. Thank you. So I've got her in the front row in case we need to throw to her, because she and Rachel had a very good interaction. So, Russell.
I'm Russell Tytler. I'm a science educator at Deakin. We've been doing a lot of research around inquiry approaches to teaching science that we argue are attempts to bring in more authentically the practices of science into classrooms, and also been doing work with school community links, which often involve schools and teachers negotiating and working with scientists. So ReMSTEP was a natural kind of home really for exploring how that might be captured in the pre-service teacher program.
And it's like the UN here. Stuart Palmer from Science Engineering and Built Environment at Deakin, and I'm Russell's counterpart, I guess, in ReMSTEP at Deakin. And not for my sins, but one of my briefs in the role I have in the faculty is outreach, and so I think that's probably naturally why I was Russell's foil at Deakin.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can we just make the panel feel welcome and give them a clap? Can I also encourage all of you to use your classroom voices? As you can hear, the guys up there have got the gain on the microphones cranked up to 11, and it's starting to feed a bit. Don't worry, they'll turn the mics down if you're too loud. So I'm going to actually do a very similar thing to what we did in the previous panel, and to go to the pointy end and ask the pre-service teachers what they think they got out of it. And then at the next step, I'm going to invite the professional educators who comprise the rest of the panel to critique the movies that we saw. Because there's a lot of love in the room, isn't there? But let's go into Stalfer and Waldorf mode, like those two old guys from the Muppets who sit up there and criticise everything. And let us really be a little bit self-critical. Not Maoist, but self-critical. But before we turn the tables, I'd just like to invite the PSTs to say, what did you get out of the scientists? What did they do for you? And maybe start with Jen and then Rachel.
Getting involved with Dr. Christine Hawkins was probably just the first step for me in thinking of an idea that I could, bigger than you would normally consider to take into a primary setting. I think I was probably one of the first primary PSTs to actually get involved with the ReMSTEP program, so I think it probably has changed a lot since I began. I know that the initial idea was to take an aspect of her research and teach that aspect to my students, but in the primary setting that's just not feasible. So for me, chatting about what she did and then taking those ideas and bringing them back down to something that I could give to my students, but at the same time make bigger than what they'd seen previously was really what I got out of that interaction.
Well, I had sort of a handful of experiences with scientists while I was a part of the Growing Tall Poppies program. So I spent about half an hour with Malizia, and I will start with that story because I did get a lot from that. From an outsider's perspective, which the cameraman said to us at the time, we were staring at a column of zeros on a computer screen, waiting for them to not be zero. And people who are scientists in the room will know that there is a lot of staring at a computer, waiting for something that we think might happen to happen. And so I was looking at that, and I was thinking about why I was so enthralled and engaged with this computer screen. And as we were doing the filming, David was in the room with us as well. All of us are sort of talking to the camera, but we're all sneaking glances at the computer to see if something interesting, what we think is going to happen will happen. And I thought about it a bit more, and I'm like, well, why am I so excited? Malizia explained to me her research. She explained to me what she was doing. She explained to me the context in which she was doing it. And I realised that I was quite knowledgeable, actually, and Malizia and I were in the same physics class, so I'm sort of only a little bit behind her in knowledge. Because I did a physics degree as well. And so I sort of had this understanding of this, which meant I knew what was happening, which meant I was so excited to see this column of zeros that was reappearing from the sample that we had sitting in an oven, a fancy oven, sorry, I don't know the technical term. And we're waiting for it to conduct electricity. It was a semiconductor. Unfortunately, in the half hour we were there, we didn't get to see anything happen, and sort of the cameraman said during the time, what are we filming? What are we trying to get from this? And we were all kind of like, it shouldn't be zero. Maybe, I don't know. And sort of, we're playing with this equipment. And I sort of realised I was so engaged because I knew it was happening and I could understand it and we could adjust it and we could do this science. And so I sort of thought about it a bit more and how I could take why I was excited into a classroom setting. So these kids, I will be a physics teacher once I've graduated, but in this physics classroom, how can I engage kids? Because obviously, we know that end of high school kids who are doing physics actually have a good understanding, could have a solid knowledge, and so they would understand what's happening in these labs. If we explain it to them and show them, they will know what's happening, and they won't see a column of zeros. They will see this computer screen that's going to tell us something really interesting, and we can understand how we can use that in the real world. So that little tiny experience for me, which I don't think I explained as best I could have. I was so excited how I can take what I learnt from that experience and how I can take it into a classroom. And I suppose the other interactions I had were with the scientists with kids. David spoke briefly about the Growing Tall Poppies program, but these kids were part of an outreach program. They came into La Trobe. They spent time with scientists, and there were two groups. One was looking at the cochlear implant and the other one was looking at something else.
Writing the names on a hair with an AFM.
Thank you very much. And they sort of came in, and I saw them at the beginning, and they were all like, when David said to them, "Are you interested in science?" they were all like, "Yeah, sort of."
Is that sort of body language too?
Yeah, it was the shoulder, and they sort of, some of them were like, "I want to do this, this and this, and I need physics to do it," but they weren't interested in doing physics. And kind of none of them were that keen in pursuing physics. Some in science, but not so much physics. But by the end of it, all of them were like, "This is great, I've learnt so much." And one girl actually brought me to tears when she said, "I'm not a nerd here. I fit in here. Everyone likes physics, everyone's doing physics, whereas in school, not everyone likes physics." And so I was sort of able to see how their interactions with scientists, and they used, fancy X-ray machines, and they wrote their names on hairs. They actually did that, and they did experiments and all these kinds of things, and these scientists guided them through that. And so I suppose I got from the scientists seeing how these kids, how their views on science could change. Because they, of course, thought a scientist did science, and when someone said, "What is science?" they said, "Well, it's what scientists do." And there was this kind of circle of no one really knowing what a scientist does and see the applications of science in their lives. And so these scientists were able to show these kids, and these kids completely changed their views. So I thought the program was amazing. I did only attend one session, but I got so much, and I could tell that this program was doing this amazing work with kids every time. So I got a lot from that sort of 2.5, 3 days.
Thank you for that glowing testimonial. We might come back to that, but I'd like to now, let's turn the tables, and I invite you guys. I've thought about this very deeply for quite some time, well before ReMSTEP, about what When I first joined the ReMSTEP program, I slightly sarcastically termed it pixie dust, this magic transference of some quality between the scientist and the pre-service teacher and the students, and that everybody knows that it happens. And I invite, maybe start with Gail, looking critically at the testimonials and the video footage, what do you see as some of the pitfalls and some of the areas to be cautious about and that we need to improve upon?
Good question.
Don't hold back, I'll protect you.
Well, before I answer that part, I want to say something else. Dionne's here, and she's actually one of our pre-service teachers in this program, so she can sort of add if she wants to. But I really want to say something about the capacity building of our teachers, in that they take the science, even at the, you talk about the primary level, but even at the secondary level, it's very difficult for our students to take the scientists, the chemists' work they've been doing, which is great, and actually put it into a package that is actually engaging and relevant and, at the students' level. And I think that's something that our students have to do. And I think what we're working at is building up that capacity. And if they do it in their training and they get experience at doing it, then when they get into schools, they'll be able to, when they're teaching their chemistry, which in our case, they'll be able to look at some cutting-edge science and have the confidence to go and say, I can actually integrate that into my teaching, and know that they have the confidence to do that and not just stick to the textbook, And so, but some of the constraints, I think what I've learned in listening to some of the scientists, I haven't made enough use of the scientists. Looking at our feedback sheets now, I realise that they would have liked to have been involved more. We've been doing this for 2 years, so we didn't get a lot of feedback last year. This year, our feedback is showing me that they would like to be involved in actually the design and working with that teaching resource, and so I think I haven't used those people enough. But the constraints, the logistics of organising it, we have to work in with those. So many people have mentioned that. I think I've made all my chemistry students on campus do it. So all of them, there was no choice in this, they all had to do it. And I think actually that's not a constraint, that was actually an affordance because they all benefited from it. So other constraints, I think, our curriculum, they have to become chemistry teachers, and yet we also want them to add this in as well. So that restriction of getting through, developing those skills that we want them to do. But I think in this area, in the future, this is actually a more important skill than making sure we've ticked all the content areas. This is actually a skill which will make sure that they can grow as teachers in future. So, but Darren might like to make a comment because you actually have that experience.
Well, the handsome Grant Mills has a microphone and he's not afraid to give it to somebody.
Just that, I've got the educator's perspective, but that's the pre-service teacher perspective.
It's good to keep it straight.
That's okay. Well, yeah, from a pre-service teacher's perspective, probably the biggest impact for me was actually realising that we could approach scientists and we could use their knowledge and insight and their kind of motivation and excitement about their work and bring that back into our preparation for our education, our resources, and it just gets everyone motivated and excited about all the possibilities. I, as a student, when I was going through high school with science, I had no idea of all the possibilities of what scientists were actually doing, and it was just something that really kind of opened it up, and I think it's really important to continue with it.
Thank you. Russell?
I was saying before in the session before how we've been doing this study of CSIRO scientists in schools and what they bring. I mean, one of the things we are interested to ask is, well, what is the knowledge that a scientist or a mathematician can bring into a school? And the answer was pretty clear from both sides of the equation, with teachers and with the scientists, and that was their ability to tell stories about their work, to exemplify ways of working, what it was like to work in a team, what it was like to work on their problems. Knowledge in the formal sense was important, but those other things were more important. And I see it very much as an identity thing that for kids in schools, if they're going to be engaged, they've got to be able to see what it is to think and work like a professional scientist or mathematician. And so I think, if I could then come back to your question, I think I used to run a course called The Science of Toys and Tricks as a primary science educator, and we do all this magic stuff, and I always saw it as a handle. But I think there's a danger in talking about, as there is a lot of rhetoric from well from scientists about going into schools and transmitting the excitement. There's a danger of thinking of scientists as white knights that are going to turn on lights. But I think there's a deeper story here about them exemplifying an orientation to phenomena, if you like. And so people were talking in the CSIRO case, we're talking about curiosity and really persistence, and the fact that if they've got a longer term project, they're working with kids, and I think it's the same with working with teachers, to represent the orientation and the person, and I think that's what Stuart was getting at too when talking about science as a human endeavour. That opens up a possibility for us to actually foreground that sort of aspect of the interaction.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight one thing, which is I think everyone agrees, you wouldn't send every scientist into a classroom, would you? And scientists love to be the smartest person in the room, as one myself. And so, yeah, I agree that the management of the scientist is quite a subtle business, and getting a pre-service teacher to get a good control of that interaction would be quite an achievement. Maybe before I throw open to questions, because I am conscious of the march of time, Stuart, what do you reckon?
Well, I guess, I said I'm an engineer, and so I sort of come from a very applied, empirical background, and so I've kind of been doing a lot of observing, maybe more than kind of theorising. But I'm a big fan of kind of getting, all sorts of exemplars into classrooms. So yes, you wouldn't want to let every kind of scientist or engineer in, maybe, but at least not unprepared. But you certainly, I guess, Brian Cox is quite engaging, but he's not representative of the full spectrum of, scientific practice.
He's got better cheekbones.
No, and we couldn't afford him. So, I'm a fan of kind of, diversity and the full experience. Maybe not at the very bottom end of, communication skills. I'm not sure. I guess one thing I have seen is, even though there have been a lot of problems, people have alluded to the timetabling problems when you're trying to get groups of people together. Certainly if you want, researchers for extended periods, you have to talk to them pretty early. There's not much point asking the day before. I mean, they'll do it if they can, but literally they may not be able to. They may not be in the place or in the country. I've seen a lot of really good things happen, but on a lot of goodwill, and I guess people have asked questions about the sustainability of ReMSTEP post-funding, and yes, that's an important question. It will be a difficult question, but other people have already said scientists are really, people involved in research and development are really happy to help out if they can, and usually with a bit of advance warning, they can.
It's interesting that doesn't seem to be one of the major constraints.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's probably more organisation than some more fundamental thing. So I don't know, a couple of quick observations.
Thank you very much. I've been given a 5-minute warning, which I'm going to discreetly ignore a little bit, because the vox of the pop is important. So can I just invite a couple of questions? Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Who's our first bidder? We've got to take it over there, please, Grant. And then who would like to be next?
I have a question for...
Could you just tell me who you are and where you're from, please?
Yeah, so I'm an honours student. I'm wondering about doing a PhD, honours student in biology, or whether to go into teaching. That's what I really want to do eventually. So my question for science educators is there a want and a need for teachers who have been scientists, aka post-PhD or researchers, in the teaching industry and in schools?
Are you going to nod all as one? Gail, do you want?
I'll say that I think the experience we've had with some of our students, the very rich experience that doing a doctorate gives you, as we've got some examples with Elise and Jules there, that you really, it enriches your teaching abilities, but you still have to learn how to teach. So, I mean, it's a little bit like this, but it's a very interesting question, because I'd like to see a lot of our teachers have more experience out in science, because when you are teaching, you draw on that very heavily. So this year I've had some students with very strong research backgrounds, and I have seen how they are embedding that, they're drawing that into their teaching. They've got a much more diverse view. They think laterally a little bit more. So it's quite interesting how that experience does impact on their teaching, and it will impact on their students' learning because they will bring that into their teaching. So did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis now on inquiry skills, and you heard Leonie this morning talking about the need to develop problem solvers who can communicate and work in teams, and I think that's precisely the sort of thing that someone with that sort of experience brings to a school. And so for me, I think if we can shift the culture of schools to, such that people are engaged and curious in that sense. And also we found when we were identifying schools with projects linking with communities, the teachers that tended to institute that were people with industrial or research experience. So I think they've got the confidence to go out and talk to and open up the science curriculum. So, yeah.
I'll inject myself as a panel member and say that doing a PhD and a Master of Teaching are beautifully symbiotic. If you want a scientific career, you're going to be a gypsy, crossing the world, going from grant to grant. You can be a relief teacher in between times. If you want to start a family, you can move in between. You can do lots of things with the two together. And if you've got a teaching qualification within the university sector, you're a very, very powerful individual. And to the point where I'm thinking about acquiring a Masters of Teaching because it would allow me to progress in my career. So don't think of it as being an either or. I suggest think about how can you get someone to pay for it.
It's more important.
Over here.
Kieran Lim. I'm a science academic from Deakin University. In looking at cutting-edge science, there seems to be a focus on the science of discovery, looking at developing new products or cutting-edge research. But yet there's a lot of science which occurs which is not discovery science. We can look at the EPA monitoring water quality, the things like management of national parks, quality control, quality assurance, all important aspects of science. Will ReMSTEP also look at those aspects of science?
Excellent question. Who wants to take it?
I think, well, thanks Kieran for your question. I think we have, because we've drawn on scientists from within the university, we've tended to focus on people at a cutting edge. But I mean, I know with Peter and her students going out to scientists, I mean, there are a range of people that our students can interact with, and I'm sure they'd be, I mean, the model is set up such that range would be represented, I would think so. One of the things that I'd have to say, with the call for a bid on this project, the emphasis was on top-level research institutions. It was of that nature, and we've had to think about, well, when we're talking about cutting-edge science, do we also include, the science that's more local? And we've decided if it's what scientists are doing now, then it's contemporary science. And so I think that's important. I mean, every kid, we're not going to put up Nobel Prizes as the kind of aim for every kid in schools, are we? So, yeah.
And certainly some of the exemplars we've been able to draw on from the IFM at Deakin, it's commercial research. So it's not discovery-funded research. It's very much about what industry want. So it's applied research, it's refinement, it's optimization, it's use of existing materials to make new products. So it isn't the blue sky stuff. It is very much the applied. Not every day, it's not sampling the river, but it is very much applied work.
Very good question. Thank you, Kieran. On this side, yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon. I'm a current classroom teacher, but I'm also the Vice President of the Maths Association. And I'm just wondering, as far as the ReMSTEP conference, there's been a lot of focus on getting scientists into the classroom. What sort of push is there to get mathematicians? Because most mathematicians are not people. We tend to be not people. And getting that push into the mathematics field as opposed to just science, but also connecting current classroom practitioners with scientists and things like that, the people that can actually, if we're not pre-service, so we're not actually in a university anymore, how do we connect with scientists that are interested in our local areas?
Can I reshape your question slightly, which is a fantastic question, and ask, because there's two questions there. The first one is, I'd ask the panel, would anyone care to reflect on their attempts to get the mathematicians' good oil into your programs? Now, fairly obviously for the PSTs this might not apply, but it does seem to be a challenge. There seems to be a gap here in what we're presenting. Where's the maths? And is that the same question as where are the mathematicians? Or is the maths embedded in some important way? And if so, can we articulate that? So over to you three guys who are sort of got the bricks and you're building it. Where are the mathematicians? Why didn't you find them?
I really think we have to draw on we've just done this work with mathematicians in schools, and there does seem to be a little gap in how mathematicians can be utilised well in schools, and I think we need resources to help that, and it's been identified there. Having a mathematician who can actually connect and engage and see the relevance with the school, with not really not teaching the curriculum, but seeing the relevance of the things they can represent, I think is a gap that we need to find. And that's come out in this evaluation.
Can I just add something to it? Mathematicians, architecture is a good place to include maths, and engineering certainly is. So if we had the architects and engineers talking about maths, you're more likely to get maths in the school.
Is that the same? That's a very good point. Is that the same thing as you're saying? Is it good enough to have Trojan horse mathematicians, like a physicist walking in and saying, "Oh yeah, I do maths"? Do you need mathematicians to do that?
Well, according to the grade sixes, yes.
I wouldn't argue with grade
You
six.
need somebody who's in the workforce who has a maths as part of their job, before their job and the experience of doing maths. And obviously, without being rude to anyone, there's a fantastic focus on science, but no thought about where are the occupations where maths is required, and there are a lot of occupations where maths is required. So that's a challenge for ReMSTEP in terms of organisation to start putting that on board in terms of best practice that you're introducing to science, to let's start putting that into maths as well.
But I think we're not unaware of this problem. Sorry, Wendy, did you want to?
I was going to say something because David and I had quite a bit to do with the bees project and adaptation.
Can we have a microphone sorry, just because I think this is going to be good. Keep going. Stand up and
you proved yourself in one phrase, Wendy.
I'll stand up. But in the bee adaptations one, we actually, and I had him out of we actually worked with a Melbourne University mathematician, and we looked at how we could integrate real mathematics into that whole program. And one of the things that came out of that also with scientists that I don't think a lot of people have picked up is the incredible passion of the scientists, which is absolutely contagious. And Ken Walker, who was with us, I just went home after the first meeting and thought, I couldn't wait to sort of go out and find some bees. He's that sort of a person. But even the mathematician who came out to Deakin, and we sort of discussed how we could look at, where the maths was in that from a mathematician's point of view. So
thank you very much.
That's still not really addressing the question from the point of view that maths is not really being... I'm not trying to be rude, but maths is not really being addressed, and I really would like to see the panel genuinely looks for occupations such as the architecture that was mentioned. I think that would be a really great scope to head in that direction. And design to get some stuff happening there, because if you don't know how to do it, then how are teachers or pre-service teachers going to know how to do it? They're not. And again, we're going to have that big gap, and we want to integrate both areas because both areas have equal importance.
I think one of the issues we are grappling with is that what we talked about and what we have been talking about with the activities that we've been doing is how we bring in the maths as modelling, for instance, or as the use of data analysis and so on. My maths education colleagues, though, say that's fine, but it's not really what I mean by maths. That I want mathematical thinking that goes beyond maths as a servant. I want something more fundamental, and so we have been. I'm just saying that there is a conceptual issue there.
So we're well and truly out of time, and it breaks my heart.
Yeah.
All right. Because it's you, Lou, and I owe you. Who's his name? Stephen Bow. Relative.
Okay.
Excellent. So that's actually a perfect question, because what I entreat you is, number one, do not let up on us about this issue of mathematics. Just give us a hard time. We want to give a hard time. Is that right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And if at the end of this conference we can have more concrete, like talk to this person, they can help you do something. That's been happening a lot already at this conference, and I think it's one of our strongest outputs, building the relationships. So I'll hand over to Vaughan to try and sum up.
Yeah, my job is to sum all this up. It's not possible. We will keep working on the 7 questions. We really appreciate all of the insights from today. They will be the continuing way that we work on what do we mean by reconceptualising? How can we address those issues raised in those 7 questions around how to make it work, sustainable, and have broader impact? Thanks very much for your input. Thanks.